Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about Book 7 of Plato's Republic. So Book 7 largely focuses on the education of the philosopher-kings. So in this sense, it picks up from a lot of things that the Republic has already talked about in previous books. We've got several books that are dedicated to this question of education. And for the most part, what Book 7 ends up focusing on is the set of phases that the philosopher-kings should go through in their education, starting with education in music and poetry and physical training, which have been discussed earlier in the book. But then Socrates turns to where the training goes from there. And basically, the training becomes more stringent and specified in order to progressively weed out people who are less capable of being philosopher-kings. So 10 years of education in mathematical science, and I'm just giving you the summary from the introductory bit here, but this is the gist of much of the book anyway. So 10 years in mathematics, 5 years in dialectic, 15 years of practical political training, and then finally the study of the good itself, which is ultimately what Socrates is incredibly interested in. So that's the bulk of what Book 7 is really about. And ultimately this is based on It's based on a couple of premises that, again, have been developed earlier in the Republic in different sections. So one, for instance, is that Socrates says here, the power to learn is present in everyone's soul, and that the instrument with which each learns is like an eye that cannot be turned around from darkness to light without turning the whole body. This instrument cannot be turned around from that which is coming into being without turning the whole soul until it is able to study that which is and the brightest thing that is, namely the one we call the good. So ultimately, again, for Socrates or Plato or both, the purpose of education ultimately is to understand the good as a philosophical concept. We still don't have a clear definition of that beyond it's the best stuff that there is. So, that's a little bit frustrating, but, ultimately that idea that, education ultimately pushes toward the deepest understanding possible of the most important concepts possible, I actually have a lot of sympathy for that argument. Even though Socrates does not do a good job of defining what the good is and how it could be studied, etc., etc. And what he says here, a little bit later, he says, it is our task as founders then, that is, founders of the Kallipolis, or the ideal city, to compel the best natures to reach the study we said before, the study we said before is the most important, namely, to make the ascent and see the good. But when they've made it and have looked sufficiently, we mustn't allow them to do what they're allowed to do today. And Glaucon asks, what's that? And Socrates says, to stay there and refuse to go down again to the prisoners in the cave, I'll come back to that in just a second, to share their labors and honors, whether they are of less worth or of greater. So essentially, Socrates is saying here, unlike today, where philosophers get to go and find the good and explore this great, incredible idea, and then just continue doing that without helping anyone in any practical way. In the ideal city, no. They would be compelled to return from the peak of philosophy to practical purposes of leading this society. And Glaucon objects, but would they want to do that? And Socrates, again, returns to this point that's already been made. This idea that The goal, ultimately, of the Callipolis is not to provide the greatest happiness for a minority, but the greatest happiness across the board. Again, this is a utilitarian approach that Socrates is taking here. The majority should be as happy as possible, even if that means that the people at the top need to sort of come down and serve those people by being their rulers. There's a little bit of a logical problem there, but Socrates anticipates this logical problem that being a ruler is not typically regarded as a punishment. Because essentially what he says is one of the key characteristics of the ideal ruler should be that they do not want to rule. They are opposed to the idea of ruling, and the real problems in a society arise, or at least some of the real problems in a society arise, from when rulers actually want to rule and therefore seek power for its own sake, which leads to civil wars, etc., etc. So, this is how Socrates envisions this ideal city running. It will be ruled by the smartest people who are philosophers and have sought the good, who have been extensively trained, whose access to ideas and arts, etc., has been curtailed in such a way that it only reflects the particular moral ideas and values that those philosopher-kings should be imbued with, etc., etc. So we have this comprehensive education system meant to create the ideal rulers. So that's the bulk of Book 7, is this set of ideas. What's unique and important about Book 7 is we have possibly the most famous thing that Plato ever wrote in it, which is the Allegory of the Cave, which is right at the beginning of Book 7. So essentially, the Allegory of the Cave, in a nutshell, is you imagine that there are a group of people born into a cave. They are strapped down, essentially. They are physically shackled. Their heads are secured, so they can only look forward at the back of the cave wall. And behind them, there's a large fire, and there's people doing basically shadow puppet theater. And those people will talk sometimes, so the prisoners in the cave can hear sort of echoes bouncing off, and they think it's the shadows talking. Now, what Socrates posits is that those people raised in that situation would believe that those shadows are the real world. He'd believe that the people the prisoners in that cave would believe that that is the truth of the world. The world is of shadows. And what Socrates posits is that if one individual were then released from those bonds and brought out into the real world, he would at first, and Socrates does gender this person male, at least in this translation, by G.M.A. Grube. But I suspect this is probably right, even though in other places in the Republic, Socrates has said, yes, gender equality. But then the gender equality is still always compromised by men owning wives, etc., etc. Whatever, different issue. So the person who was brought out from the cave would at first be blinded by the light. They would be physically unable to see anything. And then, as their sight adjusted, they would first start to perceive shadows, which they would be familiar with, because that would be the real world to them. But then they would start to perceive other things. They would start to perceive physical objects. Particularly, they would start to perceive things at night. They would, when it's darker, their eyes would have an easier time. But they would start to perceive physical objects, as opposed to just two-dimensional shadows on a wall. And if you pointed to them, Socrates says, if you pointed to those physical objects and says, that is a person, that is a laptop. Not that Socrates had a laptop, but you know what I mean. If you said that's this physical thing that you previously thought was just composed of the shadow, they would at first be unwilling to believe it. They would be unable to conceptualize the difference between the reality that they know and the reality that they have been thrust into. But they would continue to experience more and more things, and they would become increasingly convinced of the reality of the world that they are now within. Finally, the final stage of their sort of emergence, psychological emergence from the cave, would be that they would be able to perceive the sun itself, the source of light and metaphorically of truth in this. So this is the idea. The allegory of the cave is all about this process of coming from a world of images, of imperfect forms, to a world of perfect forms, or of understanding the ideal form in Platonic philosophy. This is essentially what the allegory is about. You start by having this belief that the physical world is the real world, that it is truth. And then through the study of philosophy, through refining your mind, you come closer and closer and closer to understanding the actual truth, which is the divine ideal forms of things. You are brought into the light, as it were. Now, what Socrates does say is that ultimately, if this person were then to go back to the cave, the other people in the cave who had not been brought out and who continued to believe that the world of shadows was the real world would, A, mock this person for their new insights, even though those new insights are a truer truth than the world of shadows that they know, and that it would be incredibly challenging for this philosopher who has gone out into the world to convince his fellow cave dwellers that the world that they are seeing, the world that they experience, is merely a world of shadows. But this is the challenge of philosophy for Plato, is not simply to say, well, I have learned that there's a deeper truth, therefore I am content, but I have learned that there's a deeper truth, and I have an ethical obligation to bring that deeper truth to the people who don't yet know about